Hey everybody, I'm back. After just finishing episode 109 of Hawk Blogger Mornings, recapping the 2024 Seahawks offseason, I wanted to do a quick emergency pod as the Jamal Adams news has broken. It broke during the show, and I mentioned it there, but I'll say again, Jamal Adams has signed with the Tennessee Titans. It's being reported by Field Yates and others. And while for most people that is a blip on the radar, I think it's worth taking a moment to recognize that closes that chapter on Jamal Adams as a Seattle Seahawk. You had John Schneider and Mike McDonald talk about Jamal Adams and the desire to potentially bring him back. So there was a potential that the Seahawks were going to still have more Jamal Adams moments. And that is no longer the case. He has decided to sign with another team, with the Tennessee Titans. He will not be a Seattle Seahawk. And there are some implications to this move that might be a little bit surprising to some. So the only real reason that John Schneider and Mike McDonald would be talking about Jamal Adams the way that they were was because they had potential reason to want to bring him back. Well, if they had potential reason to want to bring him back, and they specifically had talked about linebacker being the place where they saw him being best fit, that also has the implication that they are aware that they are still thin at linebacker. And just to give you a reminder about the Seahawks depth chart at linebacker, it is Jerome Baker and Tyrell Dodson as the starters, neither of which played during OTAs due to injuries, neither of which have ever played a snap for the Seahawks. Behind those two guys, you've got John Radigan, Patrick O'Connell, Drake Thomas, and Tyrese Knight. So it's a pretty thin group. They may be getting to the point where they feel better about Tyrese Knight. He started to seemingly play a little bit better at the end of OTAs. Maybe once pads get on, we'll see even more. But I think the general implication is that the Seahawks would like to find another linebacker. And so what I wanted to do, I did a whole episode on linebacker options for the Seahawks, assuming that they were looking for some. And ironically, back then, I got a lot of feedback. Hey, you didn't include Jamal Adams in that list. And I was really looking at new names, but it was a fair comment. And the reality was I thought Jamal Adams was probably the most likely guy that they would bring back. And while everyone was pretty down on Jamal from a safety perspective, and I think for good reason last season, toward the end, his injury clearly became an issue. As a linebacker, I think he had some profiled differently and may end up being a decent linebacker, depending on his health primarily. So I wish him the best in Tennessee. I have no issues with Jamal, generally speaking. I know he hasn't always been a fan favorite. I know he had a lot of challenging plays. I know he cost a lot of money, a lot of draft picks, and didn't work out. But I think where I differ from most people on the Jamal Adams move, the initial move, was at that point, the Seahawks were drafting in the 20s most of the time. And Jamal Adams was a legitimate all-pro player, a blue chip player at safety. He was considered one of the best defensive players, period, in the NFL for the Jets. And the Seahawks, if they had wanted to move into the top 5 to draft a player that was of his caliber, a top 5 player, they would have had to trade at least probably what they ended up trading for Jamal, 2 first-round picks and some change to move up from the 20s to the top 5. And I was always a proponent of the Seahawks finding blue chip players. And I thought Jamal Adams was going to be one. He had been one throughout his career. He was still very young, but it didn't work out. Some people talk about that first season when he broke the record for most sacks by a secondary player as being proof that he was playing really well. I didn't think that was a great year either for him. I don't think he was playing that well. He certainly was a good blitzer, but he never really fully realized it. The first game he played against Atlanta was the type of game I expected, where he was just everywhere on the field. He was a difference maker at every level. And he never really recaptured that. He struggled with criticism from fans, from media, from other players, and just never really fully realized his potential here. And then the injuries just absolutely derailed things. So that's how I see it, but I understand other people may look at it a little bit differently. What I wanted to share is that list of linebacker options that I had mentioned before. So I will go through this list that I've gone through before, but it might be new to some of you. And I thought with this news, it might be worth refamiliarizing yourself with some of these names. First on the list, I go through free agents. These are guys that are able to just be signed. You don't have to trade anything to acquire them. Let me make this a little bit bigger for you. Hopefully that's a little easier to read. Shaquil Leonard, who was a all-pro, amazing linebacker, but has had multiple surgeries, nerve issues in his lower back. His team that he was an all-pro for, the Colts, let him go, cut him during the middle of last season. He signed on with the Eagles. The Eagles did not want him back. No one has signed him yet. Not really clear whether he is going to come back or not, and whether he's ever going to be the player he was or not. So Shaquil Leonard's one name. Zack Cunningham, another name. 29 years old, 6'3", 230 pounds. Played for the Eagles last year, has played for the Texans before. Veteran, classic kind of veteran linebacker. Not going to offer you much upside, but is a good run defender. And at least last year was decent in coverage. Quan Alexander, let me just double check if Quan Alexander has signed anywhere since I did this. I don't think that he has signed anywhere. So Quan Alexander is, as far as I know, chat can check me on this, but as far as I can tell, he is not signed yet. He last played for the Steelers last year. He is 30 years old. He's played for a new team every year in the last 4 years. He has had some good coverage years, and knowing that Mike McDonald looks for coverage backers might be an option. He was an absolute liability against the run. 30.3 grade last year. So there's a reason that these guys are free agents this late in the season, in the offseason. Now I get into some trade options. And again, these are all conjecture. Possible, maybe not. Shaq Thompson is aging. He's with the Panthers. He recently restructured his deal to avoid being cut. I think it's worth acknowledging, he has seen his best days, but he's been a leader. He's been a very good player for them in the past. And the connection here is that John Schneider and Dan Morgan know each other very well. Obviously, Dave Canales as well. And so if they restructured Shaq Thompson's deal to avoid being cut, it means that he still has value, but maybe a guy that they would be willing to move on from. And so depending on how things play out for them as training camp and preseason evolves, maybe Shaq Thompson becomes a guy that they would be willing to part with. Damon Clark from the Cowboys. He was a 5th-round pick in 2022. Obviously, Adam Dirty would know him. He's just 24 years old. He might be somebody who is expendable based off of the Cowboys drafting Maris Lufau this year in the draft, depending on how, again, training camp and preseason progress. but had a very good coverage grade last year of 68.8. At least it's a solidly above average coverage grade. Malik Harrison. This guy is an interesting one. Not a name that as many people talk about. 26 years old. He's a bigger linebacker, 6'3", 260 pounds. He only signed a one-year deal with Baltimore, but if they wanted to trade him, it would only be $167,000 in dead money. Pretty good backer, especially against the run, but all around, obviously, Mike Macdonald knows him. And so depending on, again, how Trenton Simpson and other linebackers work out for the Ravens over the course of the preseason, maybe he becomes a guy that is expendable. Jamison Sherwood from the Jets. They have a deep inside linebacker crew. He's 24 years old. He's on the lighter side, only 216 pounds. He was a 5th-round pick just a couple of years ago, and he is in the last year of his rookie deal. Are the Jets going to be looking to sign him to an extension? I don't know. They've got a pretty stacked group, and this was a very good player for the Jets last year. 76.1 overall grade. He did struggle a bit in coverage, which is not necessarily a great thing for Mike Macdonald. But again, this is a guy that could become more available or expendable depending on how things shake out with training camp for the Jets. Germaine Pratt, I'm not going to spend time. I think there's some ways where I could think about this being an option, but I don't think that's really an option. Nick Neeman for the Chargers. Obviously, there's the Harbaugh connection with Mike Macdonald. They did draft Junior Colson, and they do need cornerback help. So if the Seahawks have their surplus at the cornerback position, maybe there's an opportunity for them to make a trade for a guy that maybe will end up being a backup in Los Angeles to someone who could be a bigger part of the plan in Seattle for one of the players on Seattle in the cornerback room who maybe is not going to be part. And the Chargers certainly need some help at the cornerback position. Otis Reese, speaking of Tennessee, this becomes more interesting. The Tennessee linebacker room just got a little bit more crowded, assuming that Tennessee sees Jamal Adams as a linebacker. Otis Reese was a undrafted free agent in 2023. He played quite well last year in limited snaps, like end of the year. But Tennessee signed Kenneth Murray. They drafted Cedric Gray, and they drafted James Williams, the big safety / linebacker out of Miami. And now they've just signed Jamal Adams. Does this mean that Otis Reese becomes more expendable for Tennessee? I would think the answer is yes. So this guy had a great grade, 76.9 overall, 75.6 coverage grade, a name to watch. Similarly, for Tennessee, another name, Jack Gibbons, who I like quite a bit. I think they like quite a bit. I think they expect him to be a starter. 6'3", 242 pounds. He was an undrafted free agent in 2022. And again, Tennessee just signed Murray, Gray, Williams. I don't know that they keep both Reese and Gibbons after the Adams signing. So Reese to me is probably the most likely to become available via trade and probably as a cheap addition. But Gibbons is another name that could possibly be available. And who knows what happens with Cedric Gray? Maybe Cedric Gray is not that good and gets cut. Wouldn't be the last time that a 4th-round pick doesn't make the team. But that's a name to watch. This is the name that I'm most intrigued by and think that there might be real reason that this move could get made. Jamaine Davis from the Washington Commanders. He's 25 years old. He was a 1st-round pick in 2021. He is in the last year of his deal. This is a team that signed Frankie Louvu and Bobby Wagner. This guy has underperformed his draft status. And even though he's been a relatively solid overall player, you know how it goes when there's a guy that is a first-round pick and comes with a lot of hype and then just becomes average, it's not particularly well loved and definitely not something the team feels a lot of investment in. So I think there is a chance that we see Jamaine Davis traded before the season starts. And given Schneider knows Adam Peters for the Commanders and obviously Dan Quinn, this is a name I would keep an eye on, Jamaine Davis. Other guys later on, these are kind of roster cut potentials. Giles Harris with the Patriots. This was the guy that was 7th on Chris Trapasso's practice squad rankings to end last year. Shaka Hayward, I think, was on the Bengals and was a 9th on Trapasso's practice squad rankings. So those are a couple of the practice squad guys from last year that could be named. But those are a few of the guys that I think are potential names to watch out for as additions on the linebacker crew for the Seahawks now that Jamal Adams is gone and no longer a Seahawk. So keep an eye out. We'll watch if there's more news that breaks. Obviously, we will bring you live coverage of that. But for now, Jamal Adams out as a Seahawk, in as a Titan, and closes the chapter on what was one of the biggest trades the Seahawks have ever made that did not go the way the Seahawks wanted it to. All right, everybody, take care. I'm Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at HawkBlogger. See y'all soon. Please give the show a like and click subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers.